Blog Talk Radio.
Evening, everyone. Baba Kilindi here. Hope everyone's doing well. And haven't talked to folks for putting on the show, and we're getting a chance to be able to explore and talk and share with our family. You know, I don't know about the audience thing, but audience family. And we'll be talking about this evening MK Ultra. We'll be talking about Nazi experiments and programs that were put together that basically jump-started the technology of the 21st century, because we had, those experiments that went on with the Nazis that were unabated. In other words, they could do things that other civilized countries couldn't do, at least openly. They would go ahead and do things to people and experiment with things that had no bounds on them. In other words, if you wanted to do facial reconstruction and things like that, from getting hit in the face with a hammer, they just get a hammer, get one of the prisoners and hit him in the face with a hammer, then we try to reconstruct their face. And if it killed them or whatever, it didn't make any difference. They just call another person. So we'll be speaking with our one of our special guests and great friend, knowledgeable man of wisdom and energy and information, Rob Henson. It looks like Rob is here, so we're going to bring him on. Like to thank everyone for coming out. We really appreciate it when people come out and listen to the show and support the show and really make it worthwhile in dealing with, with this type of information. Since we moved into this technological area, this couldn't really be done, where you can broadcast out to the whole world from your little laptop computer, from your, you can do it in your bedroom, you can do it sitting on the toilet. I'm not on the toilet, folks, but I'm just letting you know that you can do it from anywhere. Whereas before you had to have a radio station and, be beholden to them, and you can say this and can't say that, and all these different types of things. So here we can put out our information, people can listen, and we don't have to go through all of the things that are were in the, like in the 90s and things like that, and prior. We didn't have to go through all that. So, Rob, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Kilindi. How are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you doing tonight? Snowing out your way? Yeah.
No,
your way?
Tonight, tonight's day. We finally got a break. We have been catching it recently with the snow and the icy rain and everything else. It looks like spring is trying to peek through a little bit out here in Philly. So
that's great.
Right now, it's a nice day outside. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great. This evening, I was telling the audience just before I brought you in that we'd be talking about MK Ultra and going a little deeper into the Nazis and some of the things they were doing, also into sports medicine, and really what happened with the whole thing as far as steroids and strength conversion from, ordinary human strength into super strength and things like that. So we want to get right into it because, our show, we don't even have a musical lead in because we're for information, we love music and stuff like that, but we're ready to get right in it. So let's probably start out with the the Nazis World War II, or really even prior to World War II, when they were looking for different artifacts and things that they could use when the war came to be able to augment their technology, things like the Spear of Longinus or the Spear of Destiny and the Ark of the Covenant and all these different types of things. So let's get started with the Nazis in the earlier part of the first half, the latter part of the first half of the 20th century.
Well, from what I understand and what I've studied and researched on it, they had something called the Abonaya Society. Well, hopefully I'm pronouncing it right. These German pronunciations are difficult. But you had various officers in the SS during the 30s who rose up in the Nazi hierarchy. And one of them was Heinrich Himmler, and he was heavily interested in the occult. A lot of the Nazis that were in the SS had been in secret societies and had been very interested in searching out occult matters during the 1920s, the years following the end of World War I. So that interim period between World War I and the outbreak of World War II, you have this period where a lot of the people that would wind up high up in the Nazi party, especially in the SS, were card-carrying occultists, people who were interested in the occult. They were interested in esoteric materials. They were interested in lost civilizations. They were interested in lost technologies. And they took this stuff very seriously. Now, unfortunately, looking back at the history in retrospect, a lot of what you would call mainstream academic people, mainstream history teachers throughout the school system, both at the high school level and the college level, they dismissed a lot of this as another sign or another proof that the Nazis were wacko, that they were crackpots, that they really didn't know much of anything, and that they were just crazy. However, as you start to look deeper into it, and I would tell people to do some research into it and make up their own minds as to how authentic and how serious some of this stuff really is, and that the Nazis really were into some. So in Nazi Germany, they took this stuff serious, and whereas history is now trying to paint them as crackpots, that can be dangerous, because one of the reasons why it's dangerous to just write them off is that a lot of what they were into, and a lot of what they discovered, and a lot of what they were able to experiment with, being as they had a fascist society, a fascist government, where there were large groups of people that had been reduced to the status of non-citizens or non-people. Okay, so we know of course, the German Jewish population, of course, was one of those populations of German citizens at that time that were reduced to non-people status. And there were others. There were trade unionists. There were gypsies. Anybody that didn't fit the Aryan ideal during that time period in Nazi Germany was on that list of people who were considered to be undesirables. And those are the people that, as you were talking earlier in the show, that they experimented on. Those are the people that eventually got carted off to the concentration camps and were fodder for all of these different experiments. So these people were serious about this. They were not just crazy. A lot of these people were top-level scientists. They were very educated men, and they weren't looking into these things because they were just myths and hearsay and fiction. They were looking into these things because they thought that there was something really value there that could be weaponized, that could give them power, that could put them on top. And the danger in this is that there's a lot of this same thinking going on today in certain circles of certain people who are in power, who also take these things very seriously, and who are in a position in terms of they have the connections, they have the money, they have the political influence, that they can really make these things work. And a lot of it, they are making it work. And a lot of it's leaking into every aspect of our society in ways that we have been dumbed down or not taught properly to observe what's going on properly in the right frame of mind. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier is the in performance enhancement science behind athletics, and how a lot of athletes are using performance enhancement drugs of various types, technologies of various types, to amplify their strength, their speed, their stamina, their mental focus, their endurance. All these things are actually real. And a lot of these breakthroughs, the Nazis were working on the basic rudiments of those things, and many of those things actually come out of that research. So, for instance, during World War II, the Nazis wanted to make super soldiers. And a lot of people, when you say something like that, they think about, science fiction movies, or they think about comic book movies like the Captain America movie that came out years ago, where they were talking about World War II and making super soldiers and whatnot. And in that movie, they depicted that the Nazis were working on a super soldier program, and the scientist that was working on that program defected to the United States, and he winds up working with the American government, and they make a super soldier, which is Captain America from the comic book. But the Nazis also had a guy called the Red Skull, and he was their version of it, but he was flawed, whereas Captain America was more what the scientists had in mind. But at the end of the day, all this is based on reality. Nazis really were working on super soldier technology. They had a drug called DIX, and the drug was a combination of testosterone, amphetamines, and various other drugs. It was a cocktail that was designed to create soldiers who didn't feel pain, who didn't feel fatigue, and who were stronger than normal, and who would just keep right on coming until shot them down to the last man. And this is the type of soldiers that they were trying to make near the end of the war, and they did put this drug into production called DIX. I encourage your listeners to look into it and do some research on it, because it was real. They did put it into production, and they did actually give it to certain regiments of soldiers. Fortunately, a lot of these ideas the Nazis had, they fielded them in terms of actual functionally putting them into the war too late. Because had they done this earlier, and had they not made certain military blunders that ate off and bled off a lot of their resources and their funding and their money and their energy, they may have not lost that war. And in an ideological sense, in terms of things that the United States government, and to a lesser extent the Russian government, co-opted from Nazi Germany. So even though Nazi Germany was militarily defeated, there was a lot of ideology and a lot of technology that actually made it through to the end of the war and beyond. And they brought scientists that were card-carrying Nazis. These weren't just German scientists that just happened to be, German and just happened to be loyal to Germany's government at the time. These people were card-carrying members of the SS, many of them. Many of them did do human experiments. Many of them did know about the concentration camps. They used everything from slave labor to human guinea pigs from the concentration camps. Many of these scientists were brought over here to the United States after the war between 1945 and 1955 under something called Operation Paperclip. There's articles on it. There's been books on it. This is real history, folks. This is not conspiracy theory 101. This is actually facts. These can be documented. You can go look it up on the internet if you want. There's been some books written about it. Operation Paperclip. I strongly urge your audience to look into that. One of the programs that came out of Operation Paperclip, which was, they brought Nazi scientists who were working on the camps. They were working on literally two, as far as I can tell, approaches to creating enhanced human warriors, fighters, soldiers, assassins, whatever you want to call them. And it would be the variety of departments that they would work in. One of these programs, of course, was the chemical cocktail DIX, which was an early performance-enhancing drug. If DIX was around today, and some pharmaceutical company was mass-producing this, it would be on the list of banned substances that the WADA, the World Anti-Doping Association, and the Olympic Anti-Doping Association also has one where they test the Olympic athletes for performance-enhancing drugs. This drug that the Nazis were using would definitely be on that list. So this is real stuff. This isn't fiction. This isn't me making this up. This stuff is real. And they did experiment on concentration camp inmates to see if things worked. Now, the other program that I'm aware of, my research, that they were using was a methodology of creating enhanced humans through mind control, through things like hypnosis and mind-altering drugs and those types of things. And that program went under the heading of something called Project Monarch. Okay, and Monarch eventually got co-opted by OSS when the Nazis over here on the paperclip, and Alan Dulles was one of the architects of that. And Alan Dulles, of course, if anybody wants to do the history on Alan Dulles, he was, of course, the CIA director. So he was high up in the OSS during the war, and then after the war, he and Wild Bill Donovan, basically they retooled. They were high-ranking Army intelligence personnel. They retooled the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was Allied intelligence during the war. They retooled that organization after the war was over into the Central Intelligence Agency. And this was made possible in 1947 when the then President, Harry Truman, signed the National Security Act. So there's a whole lot of things that are going on here. And the National Security Act gets signed in 1947. So that makes the CIA possible. It makes the creation of a domestic, a non-domestic, rather, spy organization or intelligence organization whose main purpose is to gather military and other types of intelligence, things that other countries are doing that may be considered not in the best interest of the United States government. And this organization was an outgrowth of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. So by 1955, Alan Dulles gives the green light for the information that the CIA has gathered from the Nazis that they've brought over, and they were bringing these guys over from roughly around the end of the war all the way through the 50s, and they brought lots of them over. A lot of them wound up working for NASA, and they are the ones who crafted the rocket systems that eventually got us to the moon, and also got a lot of our satellites in orbit, and also we're still using that technology today. Our intercontinental ballistic missile program was crafted also by these same Nazis. And a lot of these people were part of the Peenemünde rocket science group that worked out of the island of Peenemünde in Germany, and they were the people who put Hitler's V-2 rocket missile program together. So you're talking about people like General Walter Dornberger, or you're talking about people like Werner von Braun. And these guys were card-carrying Nazis. They were not just German soldiers or just German officers. Okay. They were card-carrying members of the SS. So anybody who thinks any different, and if you think that the United States government didn't know this, bringing these people over, they did know it. They absolutely knew it. What happened is that Allen Dulles took the files of their war crimes and wiped them clean in order to be able to bring them over here. Because he was told by Truman, basically, in order to kind of give himself plausible deniability, when Truman was president, Truman told him, hey, I don't want Nazis, I don't want SS guys, I don't want guys that were hardcore being brought over on this program. And so Allen Dulles just simply wiped the files clean. He kind of reconstructed the files to make these guys look squeaky clean, and actually, in all truthfulness, they were card-carrying Nazis. So that's basically how they got them over here. And they got them over here by the hundreds. But they didn't just bring over a couple dozen. They brought over their photographs that you can dig up that are floating around where you can see this whole huge groups of these guys being brought over. So, and that's not to even talk about the Nazi officers, high-ranking SS guys that escaped justice during the Nuremberg trials. For your audience, just so your audience understands what we're talking about, that are not familiar with the final days of World War II and what we're dealing with. When Germany lost the war, there were war trials convened in Nuremberg, and they were going to try all of the ex-German officers who it had become known to the Allies through Allied intelligence that these people were perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, type of thing that you were talking about earlier when you say that, I want to do an experiment on reconstructive surgery, so I hit you in the face with a hammer, and then we try to reconstruct your face just to see if it works, and if we kill you, oh well. That type of thing. Not only were the Germans criminally culpable of doing these types of things during the war to civilian personnel, people who were not even soldiers, they did these things to the people that they put in the concentration camps, but also the Japanese, Imperial Japan, who were also at war with the time. So we're at war with Germany in the European theater of operations, as they call it. We're at war with Imperial Japan, who was ally of Nazi Germany, and we were at war with them in the Pacific theater of operations. And they're the ones who actually got us into the war, because if they had never bombed Pearl Harbor, America might possibly have stayed isolationist. They might have set the war out. The United States government might never have actually physically entered World War II. Doubtless we would have supplied England with, materials to fight the war with. We were already doing that. But in terms of us actually declaring war and getting into the fight, if the Japanese had never bombed Pearl Harbor, that probably would not have happened. So I encourage people to study these things. Here's the reason why this stuff was important. Today, when you look at the news and you hear about these people who go into a shopping mall or a high school and go berserk and they shoot up, 100 people or 40 or 50 people or whatever, like the guy that went berserk in the nightclub in Florida, and then you had shootings in the schools, and you had all of these things. And you had people clamoring for tougher gun laws. What I would like people to do is apply some critical thinking to the situation and ask themselves, prior to a certain point in American history, and we're talking about a certain point in time within the last 15 to 20 years, the further back you go in the timeline in American history, the less of these random, shooters, these random lone insane gunmen you actually see. In fact, if you go back into the 1950s, you don't see hardly anything like that. I mean, if you want to do the research and you want to try to dig it up, just don't see it. It was anywhere near the amount of what you would call frequency that you see it now. Now, if you go back into the 1930s, you don't see hardly anything like that. 1920s, you see even less. So what is it that we can look at that in American society that has changed radically between, say, 1975 and 2010, where these incidences of these crazy people coming out of the woodwork and just killing innocent people and going berserk? What are the social factors involved in why suddenly we see this thing over and over and over again, and the incidences of this type of thing is kind of multiplying in geometric proportion? And what is really behind it? And of course, the argument is, well, there's too many guns out there. America is a nation that was built on guns. All right? If it had not been for the European colonists who came over to this land and basically genocided the Native American population with guns, if they hadn't had guns, that fight would have probably not gone their way. If they had to use the same implements that the Native Americans were using, that type of colonialistic empire that these European countries like England, like Spain, like France, that they were involved in the business of empire and the business of colonialism. We're talking going all the way back from the 1400s all the way up to the 1700s and beyond. It just simply wouldn't have happened if they hadn't had the gun. So the gun is what gave the Europeans the edge over the various non-European peoples that they were able to colonize and bring into their imperial domain. And you really have to ask yourself, when we start talking about American culture, it's built around the gun. We have the right to bear arms. That's actually part of the Constitution. So when you start talking about these things, guns have always been out there in pretty good numbers. If you go back to the 1920s during the Prohibition era, you had warring gangs of thugs who were selling and running bootleg liquor during the time when alcohol was actually the public sale of alcohol was illegal in America. And they had the Thompson machine guns, or the Tommy gun as it was called. You're talking about, people like Al Capone. You're talking about John Dillinger. You're talking about Bonnie and Clyde, Machine Gun Kelly, Ma Barker. These people. There was never any shortage of guns. Yet the type of activities that the criminal element who had automatic weapons, the Thompson machine gun was an automatic weapon, that they had at that time, they used them mainly on each other. Every now and then they got into a scrape with the police, but really that was the last thing they really wanted to do was get into it with the police. They usually were having wars over territory between warring gangs, warring gangsters, groups of gangsters who were all selling bootleg liquor. And then you have people like Bonnie and Clyde, and you had the Dillinger gang, and they were bank robbers and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, you did not have somebody who was not a criminal, not trying to rob a bank, not trying to sell bootleg liquor, not trying to execute members of a rival gang, but somebody who's just a lone crazy gunman who just walked out into the middle of a crowded thoroughfare and just started killing people for no reason whatsoever. You didn't have that. That didn't go on. Yet the guns to do it with, obviously, if you look at history, it was there. It's always been there. So what changed in our society to suddenly make this new type of psychotic individual, this kind of mass murdering individual show up? And is there a pattern to it? And I really challenge your listening audience to really look into that and study that. Go back in history and do the homework and see if they can see a pattern. Because what they will, if they do it like I did, they will discover that the incidences of these types of things with these types of random, lone crazy gunmen, there is a definite increase during a certain period of time when this happens, and it also coincides or is precluded by the incidence of something else that was noted by the psychiatric community. There was a gathering of the World Psychiatric Community, or International Gathering of the Psychiatric Community, in 1990. They had a meeting of all of these people who specialized, abnormal psychology. And during this conference, this is one of the gentlemen presiding over that conference got up and gave a big speech, a big talk about incidences of people who were suffering from what you would call multiple personality fragmentation disorder as a result of ritual abuse. So I want people to look into what is ritual abuse and what is multiple personality disorder. Now, what came out of this conference with these psychiatric professionals, these people in the healthcare, the mental health community professionals, that they were noting these cases cropping up all over the place during the late 80s through the early 90s. Of course, it had been happening. You can trace it back even earlier than that period, but it started to really come to the surface in terms of the professional healthcare community noticing it and also noticing a pattern between the late 80s and early 90s. They started noticing these people showing up that had these incredible cases of split personalities that weren't natural, but they had been induced. And there's a big thing about it. I would tell anybody that really is really interested in getting the scoop on it. There is something called the green bomb speech. I would challenge them to try to look that up and find it of that psychiatric meeting, that itinerary, and get the full discourse on it, because it's really fascinating. This guy who's a healthcare professional, he had more PhDs and MDs and all behind his name than you could shake a stick at, and so he was definitely an authentic professional guy in that field with a whole lot of credibility. And he basically said, hey, I thought previously that this particular type of multiple personality disorder was highly unusual. Cases of it before, say, 1920 or 1930, there were so few cases of it and it was so rare that there was debate in the psychiatric community of whether or not it was even an actual disease and or whether or not it was actually anything that was real, that this is actually really happening. There was a lot of debate in terms of the nature of it because the cases were so few and far in between. But by the 1990s, it's like an epidemic of it. Now, of course, the general public is not aware of this, but the healthcare community is aware of it. The mental health community is aware of it. So after that time period, that is when I would give it a good 15, 20 years later, is when the incidences of these, crazy people cropping up and just going into a movie theater, a shopping mall, a school, and just killing a bunch of people. That's when this thing started. So people need to ask themselves, is this random is it really got something to do with too many guns floating out there? Or is this being orchestrated? Is there something behind it? And, to my mind, the answer is yes, and it is connected, and it goes back to those Nazi mind control programs that were being worked on in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. See, that's why this stuff is important. Because I know a lot of you listening audience is trying to say, okay, this handsome guy is droning on and on about Nazis and World War II, and what the hell has that got to do with the price of tea in China today? What the hell has that got to do with what's going on with the black community today in specific, and the American community in general, and what we're dealing with in terms of, things like trying to pay our bills, trying to survive, trying to deal with this crazy government and this crazy president? Well, people describe our president as being definitely somebody who's a bit left of center in his behavior and some of the things that he says and does, and that, it worries people. Many of the things that comes out of President Trump's mouth worries people, and rightly so. And we also have a lot of these incidences of brothers and sisters being murdered by police officers unnecessarily. All these things the black community is dealing with. And here I am on the radio talking about Nazis and Nazi Germany and what went on between 1945 and 1955. And people are trying to wrap their minds around it and go, well, what the hell has that got to do with anything? And it has a lot to do with it. Because a lot of what you're seeing now, I'll quote Malcolm X when he said the chickens have come home to roost. That statement had a lot of weight to it, even back when he said it. Of course, he was referring to the Kennedy assassination, which is, again, also connected with all of this that I'm talking about. Because that, too, at least elements of that assassination plot came out of this same type of technology that you can trace back to Nazi Germany. So that's where the connections come in. Now, we take this now and we go into the area of performance-enhancing drugs and how it's also connected with that. And I want to say this. When you start looking into the history of performance-enhancing drugs, anabolic steroids, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor, IGF factor, SARMs, selective androgen receptor modifiers, things of these nature that are out there today. In the athletic community is using them. The fitness industry has been completely corrupted by this type of technology. What you're looking at with this stuff is the sugar on the donut. Okay, you go back to the 1950s, which is between 1950 and 1955, we're in the beginnings of the Cold War. And the Cold War had its origin in a lot of things. And that's another program altogether. If I wanted to get into the Cold War, if I wanted to get into Harry Truman and some of his policies and ideologies versus President Roosevelt, his predecessor, if I wanted to get into the President Eisenhower and how his administration dealt with it, and how all these things combine to give you what they call the Cold War, which many of the people that are listening who are in their 20s or 30s, they probably don't even know what the Cold War was. So, rather than throwing out a terminology and trying to box anybody out or isolate anybody, because this is about inclusion, this is about educating our community so that we can be as up to snuff information-wise on all this stuff as other communities are. The Cold War was the period between the end of World War II and roughly 1988, 1989. And it was a period of intense political hostilities between the Soviet Union and the United States primarily. You had other countries that were involved also, but the big two were the Soviet Union and the United States. And the whole big thing behind the Cold War was that the potential for a conflict between the Soviet Union and its satellite countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, and then we also have the United States in its post-World War II satellite countries as part of NATO. And I urge people to look up those words and look them up in the political context, and because they frame the world that, say, if you are now in your 20s or 30s, we're talking about the world that your parents and your grandparents came up in. That world was framed by the NATO alliance versus the Warsaw Pact alliance, and basically the United States and its influence versus the Russians and their influence. So that was the Soviet Union, their influence. And this was the tension, the dynamic tension between these two military-industrial complexes that was going on during the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, and it didn't really end into the late 80s. And it ended when, I was in New York in 1988 when the Russian President Gorbachev came to the United Nations, and he gave his classic speech on glasnost. And at the end of that, the interpretation of that with anybody that was listening to it was, for all intents and purposes, communism is dead. And right after that, the Berlin Wall went down and the Soviet Union collapsed. The Berlin Wall was a dividing line between Eastern and Western Germany, for those who are not aware of what that means. Okay, and what that meant was when Nazi Germany collapsed, the dividing line between East and West Germany, the Eastern Bloc countries that were under the influence of the Soviet Union, and everything west of that being more or less under the influence of what was remaining from the Allies. We were talking about the United States and England and France primarily. So that schism, Nazi Germany as a country, kind of defined that post-World War II schism. And so you had this dividing line. And basically a lot of the things going on behind what was called the Iron Curtain, there's another word for it, what was going on behind there in terms of what the Soviet Union was doing with some of the science that they had co-opted from the fall of Nazi Germany in terms of human performance enhancing technology. They were experimenting with things with their athletes because their athletes would become a source of propaganda when they competed in the Olympics and in the international athletic competition leading up to the Olympics with the Western countries. It was kind of a propaganda thing of my way of life and my political cultural philosophy versus yours. And I am able to produce superior people. Look at my athletes and how superior they are versus yours. Your athletes are a example or a personification of your corrupt, decadent, undisciplined society, which is why they cannot compete on an even playing ground with mine. And this was the propaganda. It was absolute bullshit on both ends. It absolutely meant absolutely nothing when it came down to the reality of it. An athlete is an athlete is an athlete. A human being is a human being. And a combination of genetics, desire, and the availability of certain types of tools, certain types of information, and certain types of technology is what will determine who's going to win, not the political ideology of the society that athlete comes from. That has nothing to do with it. But that was the game that was being played. And so the Soviet Union went on a state-sponsored program athletic enhancement that was absolutely recognized and supported and funded by the Soviet government. And a lot of the other Eastern Bloc countries also followed suit. Bulgaria, Romania, a lot of these Eastern Bloc countries did the same thing. They went on these state-sponsored drug enhancement programs for their athletes. And it was all out in the open, and it was, everybody knew it. In the United States, there was quite a different game being played altogether. And I spoke to you briefly about this earlier. The United States wasn't interested in showy performances or flouting their technological breakthroughs. They play a different game altogether. And this really goes to show you the true essence of what the difference between the so-called evil of the Soviet Union and the evil of the United States. The United States likes to point the finger at the Soviet Union as that they're a totalitarianistic society. They do a lot of under the belt, below the belt type of stuff. Even the rhetoric that's out there now. And once again, this is another connection. If you go back to the 1950s and 60s, there was all kind of political rhetoric during the Cold War about the evil Soviet Empire, the evil empire. Okay. The Cold War ended, for all intents and purposes, between 1988 and 1995, pretty much. It was pretty much over by that time. And yet, you have a lot of rhetoric today in wake of, supposedly the Russians hacking the election, the Russians being in some way responsible for President Trump being elected over Hillary Clinton, Vladimir Putin being this evil representative of the evil, Russian Empire reemerging. And so you have a lot of rhetoric amongst United States, politicians and political leaders that are trying to resurrect the rhetoric of the Cold War. If you look at the language that they speak, if you listen to them in the media, there's a concerted effort to try to recreate the atmosphere of the Cold War. So this is why it's important for people to go back in history and understand this stuff. Because those who do not learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. I know that's a cliche, but it's absolutely the truth. So during that time period, the Soviet Union had an open state-sponsored athletic enhancement program that by any means necessary, they were going to make bigger, stronger, faster, better athletes. And that was quite well publicly known. They weren't trying to hide it, not in Soviet society and definitely not on the international scene. It was very well known that there was a state-sponsored drug program going on in the Eastern Bloc countries. All right. In the United States, the athletes received no government funding. Now don't get me wrong. There's always some type of subsidy going on with sports apparel companies and other types of commercialized companies that would sponsor athletes. But the United States government as an entity did not fund or directly sponsor Olympic athletes. Meaning, if you were competing in track and field, if you were competing in weightlifting, if you were competing in boxing, the United States government wasn't giving you a government-funded stipend to live on while you did nothing but train, so that you would literally be a professional athlete in terms of your status or in terms of your reality, but not you will still be considered an amateur because you are quote unquote not making a living from your sport, yet you're being under the table subsidized by the government. That was the case with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. Those athletes, their job was from the crack of dawn until the setting of the sun was to get up and train for their particular sport. And they didn't have to worry about where they were going to live, what they were going to wear, what they were going to eat, or how much it was going to cost for the coaching, the equipment, the drugs, the vitamins, the food, the protein supplements. Everything was paid for, and everything was state-sponsored. In the United States, it was exactly the opposite. Athletes had to scrounge up their own funding. They had to get their own sponsorship. They had to work jobs and train. This is how it was. But when it came to the performance-enhancing technologies being developed, these performance-enhancing technologies were not athletic or public or commercial. They were militaristic. And that's the basic difference between the United States and the Soviet Union, in that, of course, the Soviet Union probably also had militaristic applications of the performance-enhancing technology, but they were openly experimenting with their athletes publicly. Whereas the United States played it very close to the vest in most of the performance enhancement technology prior to the late 50s that was being developed by the Nazi scientists that the OSS brought over during Operation Paperclip, the mind control techniques that can also create superhumans, and there's a specific pathway through which they do it. And that would take up an entire show that I could go into as into how they do it, or how they did it back then. They actually have the technology at this point has gone leaps and bounds beyond what it was back then. So anything that they had back then, they've got it now, 10 times better. And yet, the things that you can still look up in terms of DARPA, which is the military defense agency that deals with the testing of technologies in order to produce more advanced weaponry and more advanced soldiers for the purpose of warfare. So this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. Even the things you can look up that DARPA is doing, like the bionic Iron Man armor that they have just pretty much completed. So they've got a guy who can run through a hailstorm of automatic weapons fire up to 60 caliber machine gun bullets, and that will do nothing to this guy. Won't stop it. They've demonstrated it already. That's just icing on the donut. It's just like the space program. It's just like their advances in medical technology, their advances in communication technology. Everything that you see that we have access to or knowledge of, they're already decades, conservatively, anywhere from 20 to 30 to maybe even 50 years or beyond, more advanced than what trickles down to the private sector. So this military-industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about, and these secret enclaves of power that Kennedy also talked about, which is one of the things that got him killed, assassinated, because he actually had an open speech about secret societies and the power that they wield. These secret shadow components of the military-industrial complex, they have access to things that the general public is completely out of the loop on. So when you hear these constant that every year they have the run for cancer or the run against AIDS or they have these big campaigns where you're supposed to contribute money to cancer research or AIDS research or this or that, they've already cured these things quite some time ago. They've not only cured them, they've even found ways to weaponize cancer, to weaponize AIDS. They can give these things to people. Do you think that, for instance, somebody like Hugo Chavez, who was an opponent of the United States openly in terms of the policies that we have, our foreign policies, and many of the things that we were doing in South America. Do you think that you can shop just suddenly develop cancer for no reason? And for those, who are really not up on this stuff or who are sleepwalking through it, I would have some people in your listening audience, because your listening audience is pretty sharp. People who are listening to the Entheogenic Explorer are already up on some stuff to even be listening to a show like this. So they're pretty hardcore in terms of knowledge. I would urge them to just consider the rate of loss in the naturopathic health community, where you've just had dozens of doctors murdered, mysteriously dying in the naturopathic healing industry. People who use, non-traditional healing methods were, in fact, very effective. People like Dr. Sabi, who, was in Honduras and who I believe was murdered. These types of things are not random, and they're not mistakes, and they're not coincidences. It's a pattern. So getting back into the differences between the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Union during the 1950s in the United States in terms of performance-enhancing drugs and athletics. The United States program in that was a military program. They weren't interested in showing off their performance enhancement technology by boosting athletes. People running track or playing football or basketball or boxing or what have you. They weren't interested in that. The real technology was kept totally highly secret. And had it not been for the efforts of one particular doctor, who I believe was a civilian contractor, to take some of this technology and use it in the private sector, this guy being the genius that he was able to exploit it. And actually, through him, a certain portion of it made its way into the public sector in terms of he created the first oral, widely known anabolic steroid that literally changed the face of weightlifting and bodybuilding and sports like football, track and field, and everything else. And the gentleman's name was Dr. John Bosley Ziegler. And Ziegler was the source of a lot of eye-opening technology. But we're talking about the late 50s through the early 60s. And it's a really interesting story. And it begins roughly around 1955, 1956. And it's just roughly around the same time that Alan Dulles gives the green light for the creation of MK-Ultra. MK-Ultra was the CIA continuation of the Nazi mind control program, Project Monarch. And the head CIA doctor that presided over the MK-Ultra project for the CIA was a man named Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb. If anybody's really interested in this stuff, look these people up, please. Sidney Gottlieb was a American doctor, psychiatrist, and he got involved with the Central Intelligence Agency somewhere between 1952 and 1953. And by 55, he had been made head of what we call the Dirty Tricks Department of the CIA. In terms of the CIA's clandestine assassination program. And he was head of coming up with technologies by which they could covertly assassinate various different heads of state in countries that they felt were a threat to the interest of the United States government in terms of foreign policy. And in many cases, when you talk about Allen Dulles, that simply meant people who were on his hit list that were interfering with the financial profits of his clients that he represented in the Wall Street law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. So I would urge people to look up the connections between Sullivan and Cromwell and Allen Dulles and his brother John Dulles, who was during this period of time was Secretary of State. So you had Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, but you had his brother, who was Secretary of State. I would encourage people to do some research on these people, and their connections with the things like the United Fruit Company, for instance, or the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which was kind of the predecessor of BP, British Petroleum. I'd encourage people to kind of look these things up and look at the connections and look at why people like, say, somebody like Mohammed Mossadegh had his government overthrown in Iran. See, right now, there's a lot of rhetoric where if you look at American politics today, you have people talking about, the Iranians have a nuclear weapons program, and we need to go over and shut that down. We need to find ways of putting sanctions against them. We need to stop it. Yeah, nobody's asking, why are the Iranians mad at the United States? What put a bug up their ass against us to begin with? Could it be the fact that the CIA sponsored the overthrow of their government in the 1950s? In order to get rid of Mohammed Mossadegh's government because he wanted to nationalize the oil industry. He wanted to have Iran actually profit from their own oil deposits rather than having the British have total control over the oil, the refinement of oil and the export of oil out of Iran. He wanted Iran to actually have some of that profit, so he proposed to nationalize the oil industry. And because APOC, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, was a client of Sullivan and Cromwell, they said, hey, now that you guys are Secretary of State and the head of the CIA, we're a client of yours, can you do something to help us out? And, of course, they did. They overthrew Mohammed Mossadegh's government, and they put in the Shah of Iran. So maybe that's the reason why the Iranians are a little pissed off at us to this day. Maybe that's why they don't trust us. Maybe that's why they feel they need to have nuclear weapons in order to protect their interests. And these are the kind of things, again, all of this has its rudiments in the fallout of what happened between 1945 and 1955. So people who don't think that this history is important, and then they look at the news today, and they cannot even interpret the origin or purpose of it, or where does this stuff come from? Because nobody's going to teach it to you. Nobody's going to tell you. So, I just encourage the audience to just make some of these connections and think about it. But getting back to the non-state sponsored, or shall we say clandestine, drug enhancement, performance enhancement program in the United States, again, it was going on concurrently with the mind control program. Because by combining those two elements, the biochemical enhancement of human beings in terms of being able to manipulate the endocrine system to enhance the strength, the endurance, the explosive power, the recovery time, and then also the control of certain parts of the mind in terms of the conscious and subconscious mind in order to also create these types of enhancements and even create psychic abilities and enhancements. These projects were running concurrently, and they were an outgrowth of MK Ultra, which was an outgrowth of Monarch, which was the Nazi program. So, there's definite connections running through this. And Ziegler apparently appears to have stumbled onto something on his. Well, there's two ways to look at it. If you look at Dr. Ziegler's history, you can come to two conclusions. You can either say that he was just, such a genius that he stumbled onto these techniques and these methodologies all by his lonesome, with no help from anybody. And he decided to experiment on a specific group of athletes that were basically located out of York, Pennsylvania at the time. They were the Olympic weightlifters and the world-class weightlifters that were training under the aegis of a man named Bob Hoffman. I encourage your listening audience to look up Bob Hoffman, look up who he was, and what he did in terms of American athletics. He was one of the top people in the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, and he was a big top guy in the sport of weightlifting in the United States throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s. Bob Hoffman. He had a supplement magazine and weightlifting empire, and he was he was a big force in that area, and you really couldn't get anywhere in the AAU in weightlifting or bodybuilding without having the good graces of Bob Hoffman. So it's very important that people know who this guy was. Now, he was also a card-carrying racist, and he was known as being a racist. And he was known as saying that as long as he was the head of weightlifting and bodybuilding in the AAU, that no non-Caucasian, nobody black or Jewish, with specific that he did, was ever going to be the winner of the Mr. America contest, which was the top bodybuilding contest during that time. This is prior to the International Federation of Bodybuilders coming onto the scene under the Weider brothers. And eventually they made the Mr. Olympia contest the top bodybuilding contest in the world. We're going now back to the 30s, 40s, and 50s, when the Mr. America was the top bodybuilding contest in the United States, and the NABA Mr. Universe was the top bodybuilding competition in terms of on the world stage or the international stage, and that was pretty much sponsored over in England. So if you won the Mr. America and you won the Mr. Universe, you had like the two top bodybuilding titles in the world at that time. Well, to get to the Mr. America level, to even be qualified to go and compete in England, the Mr. Universe, you had to go through the AAU, and that means you had to go through Bob Hoffman. And Bob Hoffman was not for any kind of brothers, any kind of people with a darker persuasion, no matter how good your physique was. Now, ironically enough, that being said, two of Bob Hoffman's greatest weightlifters, arguably the man who was the strongest man in the world at the time, and another fellow who was probably one of the strongest men in the world, pound for pound, neither of them were Caucasian. During the 1940s, the top weightlifter in the world was a man named John Davis. And John Davis was African American. And he won over 12 world champion weightlifting titles. He had a record that for a long time was unbroken. I think it may still be unbroken in terms of the amount of titles that he won in a continuous stream of titles. And then World War II broke out, and he went to fight World War II, and he came back, and he started winning again. And he finally culminated his career. He went to France, and they actually filmed this, that he lifted the famous Apollon railway wheels, the axle, This is not actually a barbell. These were actually the axle and wheels of a freight car train. And it was said to be unliftable because not only was the weight tremendously heavy, but the axle was so thick that a normal human being couldn't get their hands around it. And he basically was able to clean and jerk this thing using a reverse grip, so that he basically power curled it to his shoulders, and then he pushed it overhead and caught it in midair, reversing his grip and caught it in the traditional grip, and then he military pressed it. And they have this on film in the archives, in the weightlifting sports historian archives. It's probably accessible. You might even be able to see it on YouTube somewhere. Somebody might have it. But John Davis was his name. He's an African American, and he was the greatest weightlifter of his era. So basically, he's a name that's been lost in time. Most of us know who Arnold Schwarzenegger is. We know who, the white media pushes on us. But when we start asking about our people who are great in these areas, we don't even know. Like the average black person I talk to, and I said, well, you ever heard of John Davis? They've never heard of him. They don't know who John Davis was. Well, John Davis was part of the Olympic weightlifting team when Bob Hoffman was the coach and sponsor of that team. The other guy I'm speaking about that was also possibly one of his greatest, if not in his weight class, he's definitely the greatest, and that was Tommy Kono. And Tommy Kono was Asian. So you had a black guy and an Asian guy that were like two of the best that ever did it, and Bob Hoffman, who's the head of this thing, is a complete racist. So that just goes to show you the contradiction or the irony of some things. And you and I spoke, privately about Tommy Kono and his possible connections with the martial arts champion Bruce Lee, martial arts icon Bruce Lee, that everybody is fascinated with and everybody believes was superhuman. Well, he may have been superhuman because he may have been utilizing this program that Dr. John Bosley Ziegler invented. He was definitely using aspects of it. That's without question. Whether he was using the entire program or not is up for debate. I, for one, think he was, and I gave you my reasons why, and maybe we'll do a show on that one day. Again, a lot of people will call it speculation, but I've got documentation to back things up. So at the end of the day, though, we'll just stick to the subject of interest, which is what I would call a version of the Super Soldier program that almost became commercialized and almost became publicly acknowledged, and things happened to make it go underground, which is kind of why you haven't heard of it. Because, again, the game the Americans were playing, elements within the American government and the American intelligence community and the American military community, they were not interested in public displays of where their technology actually sat on any level. So there was always a double thing going on in America. You got the public commercialized version of something, which is the sugar on the donut version of it, and then you've got the clandestine government version of it that's off the radar, and that includes everything from the military hardware to the communications technology to the space program, and up to and also including the creation of advanced type of soldiers, assassins, superhumans, as we would call them. You definitely have the technology to make them. They've been doing it for quite some time, and they keep it undercover. And the medical technology and the other types of technology that could actually come out of this, that could advance the world as the way we know it, that could heal diseases, that could make people well, that could make sick people well, that could make the world a better place. They keep a tight grip on this stuff so that we live, the low level, we live like primitives compared to what they've actually got. So the United States, the government was not about broadcasting that they could make super people like the Soviet Union was doing. Soviet Union's got, they've got, athletes showing up at the Olympics that are juiced to the gills on steroids and whatever. And the United States government is playing it a little bit more subtle. They've got things that make steroids look like cotton candy. But Ziegler was one of the guys that I believe they contracted out part of the program to. And I believe he made the connection possibly through Ciba Pharmaceuticals, where he was a biochemist and a research scientist. So he was not only a medical doctor, but he was also a research scientist as well. And he went to weightlifting meet. He wound up becoming associated with Bob Hoffman. I'm not going to get into the whole story of how that happened, other than to just say that he had a medical practice during the 1950s in Albany, Maryland. And he had taken up weightlifting after World War II. He got shot up in World War II, I believe, in the Pacific Theater. And he was told by doctors that he would not be able to regain the full use of his right arm. In terms of him being able to lift things overhead or the arm functioning properly because of the wounds he had received during the war. And he being a medical doctor and a tough, hard-headed guy, he decided that he was not going to accept that prognosis. And so he started to get into weightlifting as a way to rehabilitate his arm and shoulder area. And he succeeded. From working out, from doing bodybuilding with weights, he was able to rehabilitate himself, and that made him a firm believer in weightlifting and weight training. So when he heard about the lifters over in York, Pennsylvania, and they were training at a gym called the Broad Street Gym in York, Pennsylvania. That was this famous gym that they trained at. That was basically where all the top weightlifters in the country would come to work out at under Bob Hoffman. Well, what happened was, he decided he was going to drive to make that drive all the way from Albany, Maryland to York, Pennsylvania, in order to be in this atmosphere. It would be very similar to if during the 1970s, somebody interested in bodybuilding was living out on the West Coast, and Venice Beach was only like a 2-hour drive away, and they would be willing to make that 2-hour drive every day just so that they could train at Gold's Gym, with the top bodybuilders in the world like Arnold Schwarzenegger and, Franco Columbu and Frank Zane and Robbie Robinson and all of these people that they would read about in the magazines and whatnot. They would go, it's only 2 hours away. I'm going to go out there and actually meet these people. I'm going to go actually train with them. Well, the weightlifting facility in York, Pennsylvania, in terms of weightlifting during the 50s and 60s, had the same kind of ambiance. And so Ziegler decided to make that long drive, and he would make that drive, and he would go there and train with them. And because he was a physician, and he had all the prestige that goes with that title, Bob Hoffman decided to put Ziegler on his payroll. And he decided he wanted to see Ziegler to be associated with the weightlifting team because it kind of made them look more official, so to speak, to have a guy of that caliber working with them. So he became like the team physician for the weightlifters. And as a result of this, he wound up going overseas with them to Europe, to Vienna, I think it was, for weightlifting meet. Now, this is during the height of the Cold War. This is between 1955 and 1956. So you got to mark the dates on this because, again, the CIA has initiated MKUltra around the same time. And I believe that there are definite connections. The MKUltra is essentially a mind control program through the use of drugs, hypnosis, and other types of techniques. And Ziegler just happened to be a trained hypnotherapist. So there's all of these connections that are there, and if you want to really research it and look at it, So Ziegler, while he's at this weightlifting meet, the United States is competing against the Russians. And he's noticing that the Russian athletes are markedly stronger than they had been in previous meets in a shorter period of time. And he wants to know why. He also notices that the Russian athletes, are being catheterized. He's backstage where they're preparing, and he's seeing that they're literally, the doctor is sticking a catheter in their bladder and draining it. So he's kind of going, okay, using his knowledge of the endocrine system, anybody knowledgeable in that, had I been backstage and saw that, I would have come to the same conclusions that he had come to, that, okay, these guys are being catheterized, they're much stronger than they used to be, in a short period of time, something's going on here. Possibly they're being, somehow their testosterone level is being boosted. So that's all of those things are signs of that. So what he did was he went out drinking after the meet. He went out drinking with the Russian coach. And he got the Russian coach drunk on vodka. Ziegler was noted for being a heavy drinker and a man who could really hold his alcohol. And so the fact that he was able to drink a Russian under the table with drinking vodka, the Russian team found this quite a novelty, that this American could hold his liquor like that. And so, being plied with alcohol, they started to loosen up, and they started to talk. And during the conversation, it came to light the Russian athletes, were indeed being administered shots of testosterone, which explained everything. It explained the increases in strength, but it also explained that why they had to be catheterized, because when you take large amounts of exogenous testosterone, the testosterone converts into another chemical called dihydrotestosterone. And dihydrotestosterone has a marked effect on the prostate gland, and that it can cause something called BP, which is benign prostate hypertrophy, which is BPH. A lot of older men develop this when they get in their late 40s to mid-50s. They start to develop that condition due to the fact that the testosterone in their body is being converted into dihydrotestosterone, and dihydrotestosterone is causing the prostate gland to swell up. And this is a complex, I'm not going to get into the entire biochemistry of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, because I'm sure it would just bore your audience to tears. But it is within that axis that a lot of these malfunctions occur as a result of the use of exogenous testosterone. Exogenous testosterone being testosterone that's not being manufactured by your body's chemistry, but it's being injected into your body from outside. So there's a whole lot of side effects that come with that. And swelling up of the prostate gland as well. And of course, when the prostate gland swells up, it partially occludes or blocks the urinary tract, and you can't pee. Thus, the athletes had to be catheterized. So Ziegler looked at all this, and he just, as being the physician that he was and the medical scientist that he was, he knew what he was looking at, and he said, okay, these guys are being plied with testosterone. I got to get these guys to talk, to find out what's going on. And he got the Russian doctor drunk, and the Russian coaches started to talk, and he basically said, okay, the Olympic Games are coming up, and these guys are going to kill us in the Olympics because they're using, performance enhancement technology. So he came back to the United States, being the patriotic American, white man that he was, and he decided that he was going to come up with something to give our boys a chance to compete on an even field with the Russians. And this is where it gets really interesting. So he goes to Cibo Pharmaceuticals, and anybody who doesn't know who Cibo Pharmaceuticals is, I encourage them to look that up. Look up Cibo Pharmaceuticals, look up what they are, look up their history, and so forth and so on. And anyway, he was already a research scientist at Cibo Pharmaceuticals. So he already had a lab there. And he went there and he dug up he accessed Siever's files on German testosterone analogs. So now we're talking about companies like IG Farben. And anybody who doesn't know who IG Farben is, I advise them to look that up. But a little brief history on the history of anabolic steroids, just a very quick, just to inform your listeners so that they really know they can go in depth on this topic. Steroid analogs were discovered as far back as the 1930s. So steroids are nothing new. They've been around for quite some time. But they were not used extensively by the medical community because they were, A, too expensive to manufacture, and then 2, they were only considered to be useful for people who had diseases, muscle-wasting diseases like cancer or somebody who was a burn victim, things of that nature. This is what the steroids were developed for. They weren't developed for athletes or healthy people, So a lot of the testosterone analogs, by testosterone analog, I mean a drug, a chemical compound that mimics the same activity as natural testosterone. Testosterone, of course, is responsible it's the hormone that makes men men, as an estrogen is the hormone that makes women women. So testosterone is the male hormone. And testosterone is where you get your vitality. It's where you get your strength, your muscles, your masculinity. This is your sexual potency. This is what makes you a man, okay? And a synthetic analog of testosterone would be a chemical compound that is designed specifically to mimic the effects of testosterone. So that's basically what steroid analog is. And they had dozens of these testosterone analogs, in terms of the chemical formulas for these compounds. But they had, most of the pharmaceutical companies had not actually produced them. You could not go to a pharmaceutical company and get a prescription for this and be, a regular citizen. So most of the bodybuilders from back in that era were not using steroids. So if you're going back to the 1930s, 1940s, even though they existed, they were completely unknown to the regular general public, and no bodybuilders would have known about them or been able to get their hands on them even if they did, because they just weren't being used outside of a very tightly knit group of research scientists and doctors who specialized in that kind of thing. Were the only ones who would even know what a testosterone analog was. So an anabolic steroid, anybody accusing somebody like Steve Reeves, who won the Mr. America and the Mr. Universe in the 1940s, or Reg Park, the British bodybuilding champion, who won the Mr. Universe around the same time. Guys like that, those guys did it naturally, and they proved you could build muscles, without taking steroids because they didn't have access to them. Okay, there was another African American bodybuilder named Leroy Colbert. There was another brother named Arthur Harris. These guys had physiques that were phenomenal for the 1940s and 50s. And the brother I mentioned earlier, John Davis, he also, again, he was winning his world weightlifting titles way before steroids would have been in any way available to anybody in the weightlifting community. So this brings us back to Ziegler. Ziegler comes back. This is in the 1950s. This is after MKUltra has already been put into action by Allen Dulles and the CIA. I want people not to lose that connection. We're talking the mid to late 50s. So Ziegler comes back. He goes to work at Ciba Pharmaceuticals, and he accesses their government files on the Nazi testosterone experiments and all the information that they have on that. A lot of the pharmaceutical companies have been given this information by the government after the government was able to access the Nazi files on these type of experiments. So the Nazis were kind of ahead of everybody in terms of this stuff. They were already using it. What happens is Ziegler decides to make a steroid compound that can be orally absorbed, meaning you can swallow it. You don't have to. This doesn't have to be injected into you. I want people that are listening to understand that there are two types of anabolic steroids. They are basically there's an oral and there's injectable. What Ziegler came up with was an oral compound called methandrostenolone. Okay, so, just hopefully, again, a lot of this is getting very technical, and I'm hoping people are following me with this. So if there's any, questions or comments at this time, I encourage people to feel free to ask. Kilindi, I know we're coming in up on the time limit here, so do you want me to kind of...
Why don't we get a couple of questions and see where we can go for that for the last few here, and we still have to do our commercial. So, 419, you've been holding. Do you have any questions or anything for Rob or myself?
No questions right now. It's fascinating. I'm fascinated sitting here, fascinated. So enjoying the whole conversation.
Thank you for calling in and your support. We're going to move right along. 702. Do you have any questions? Okay. 702.
No. Oh, hello. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
No questions at this time. Thank you guys for sharing the information.
Thank you for calling in. 313, you're on with us. Thank you for calling in. Do you have any questions?
Oh yes. No questions. Just
right.
Thank you for the information.
Okay, thank you. 520. Any questions?
No questions. Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Okay, let's try one more, and then because everybody seems to be listening intently. 336. Do you have any questions?
Hold on, sir. Yes. Greetings, Bob. I came in on this conversation late, but I did want to know what would be since I've looked at some of your YouTube's videos last couple of 24 hours. What would be like a proper dosage of the psilocybin to start out on?
Okay. Well, we have a protocol that we suggest to people, and that's starting out with 5 dry grams of psilocybin mushrooms, and with a sitter for the first 3 times that you take it. And that sitter doesn't have to be in the same room with you, but you would be in a room in the dark, and the sitter's just in the house in case you need to talk to somebody or need to, be in a place where you may need some assistance, like, some folks don't navigate real good, things like that. So they may help you to the bathroom, may turn on the light for you, stuff like that. And after the 3 times, after your three times that you take it, then we suggest that you basically fly solo and, do it on your own without the sitter. But you can still, of course, use the sitter if you like. But we suggest starting out with 5 dry grams. That's a nice dose which gets most people in.
Okay. 5 dry grams. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go back on mute and listen.
All right. Okay, Rob. Let's continue until the end. So.
All right. Well, I left off that the first performance enhancing American steroid, oral steroid, was methandrostenolone, and it was an oral steroid, and it was administered in dosages of the dosing protocol that Ziegler came up with for the athletes that he was administering this drug to. You have to remember, Ziegler, this was a totally experimental thing at the time, so nobody knew exactly what it was going to be. He went through a number of different stages before he eventually came upon methadrostenolone. At first, from what I can ascertain from articles that were written about him and from what you would call eyewitness accounts of some of the people involved, he used a testosterone compound first. And the testosterone, which is pretty much what the Russians were using, didn't have that big of an effect. Is from what I could gather. So he then decided that he wanted to create a compound that had a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio. I'm not quite sure if it was 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. Anabolic to androgenic ratio. And for your listening audience, what that means is testosterone has two functions. It has an androgenic function and an anabolic function. The androgenic function is what deals with your secondary male sex characteristics, the development of your sex organs, the hair growth, facial hair, body hair, the deepening of your voice, all the things that as you go past from puberty into adolescence into adulthood, testosterone hits your system and it causes these changes that cause you to go from being a boy into a man. So that's basically what testosterone does in terms of its androgenic properties. The anabolic properties are its tissue building properties, specifically its muscle tissue building properties. And that's what athletes are interested in. They're interested in enhancing their ability to build muscle size and strength. And testosterone does that by attaching itself to what is called an androgen receptor. And the androgen receptor, basically when the testosterone attaches there, signals the ribonucleic acid so that the ribosomes start to manufacture or synthesize amino acids in the muscle tissue. That's the process that's going on biochemically. So what's going on is that testosterone has an androgenic signal, but it also has an anabolic signal. And the androgenic signal is kind of unwanted. That's where all the negative side effects come from. That's where you have effects that will, for instance, affect your sex drive, or not so much increasing it, it can actually cut it down or cut it off, which of course nobody wants. It can cause hair loss. It can cause things like increased blood pressure. It can cause increased negative cholesterol profile in your body, so that you develop, arteriosclerosis and hardening of the gumming up of the heart. This could lead to a heart attack or stroke. So it can do a lot of negative things in terms of the androgenic side effects. The anabolic effect is just its ability to spur the body into retaining nitrogen, enhancing the development of protein into muscle tissue, the synthesis of amino acids in the muscle tissue. That's the actual effect that anybody that takes steroids is after. They don't want the other stuff. So what Ziegler did was he decided to create a synthetic compound or to take one of the formulas that were already, there was a catalog of these formulas that the compounds had not actually been synthesized. He took one of the methadrostenolone and he synthesized it, and he made the first oral anabolic steroid that had this 2-to-1 ratio where it was twice as anabolic as it was androgenic. So he really beefed up its muscle building capacity. And the tablets were given to the athletes he selected. And they were basically told to start off with a protocol of 5 milligrams per day for the first week, 10 milligrams for the second week. It might have been 2 weeks. It might have been 2 weeks of 5 milligrams, 2 weeks of 10 milligrams, and then 2 weeks of 20 milligrams. And then they were supposed to get their liver enzymes checked. Because, again, anytime you're taking an oral steroid compound, it's going to affect your liver. And so they were to be monitored to see that their liver enzyme profile wasn't going crazy. And then they were going to taper off a week off and then go back on. So it was kind of this kind of 6-week protocol or what have you. So that's basically what the original protocol was. And if you understand the type of dosages and stacks of different drugs that bodybuilders progress through during the 60s when this Pandora's box got open, and they just basically applied the if a little bit is good, the more is twice as good. You know, the more is better syndrome, and that's how things got out of hand. And Ziegler really was disappointed in that, and that the athletes eventually, SIBA started to produce the methamphetamine, and you could get it with a prescription. And so the athletes started just go on their own with it, and that's how it really started to get out of hand, and it basically changed the face of what you would call social bodybuilding in terms of the social commercial sector. Now, what was going on behind the scenes was a whole other story, because Ziegler had other technologies. This is what kind of separates him from just being the doctor that came up with steroids, and that he also came up with other technologies that could enhance human performance, and these were of a more esoteric nature. I mean, steroids people understand. They know what steroids are. But he came up with a machine called the isotron. And the machine was basically a machine that could shoot electrical current through the body and cause the muscles to have extreme muscle contraction. And this machine actually was capable of building muscle strength, enhancing even the way the nervous system functioned in terms of the way the body fired off motor units or neurons that attached to motor units that cause muscles to contract. So this was a big, big leap in terms of if you're trying to create people who are superhumanly strong. One of the barriers to human super strength is the human nervous system, in terms of the way the human nervous system is constructed, and that in terms of voluntary muscle contraction, the physiology of voluntary muscle contraction when you are in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Again, I'm throwing out terms that physiologists and doctors use, and I apologize for that, so I'm going to break it down for your audience. There's basically two separate nervous system modalities in the human body. One of them deals with ordinary circumstances in your environment, ordinary levels of stimuli. Okay, and so you're talking about respiration, digestion, things of this nature under ordinary circumstances. You know, you're sitting in the living room, you just ate a hamburger, you're watching Monday Night Football or your favorite soap opera or your favorite TV show, and you're having a beer maybe and whatever, and everything is just fine. That's the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, if somebody was to throw a brick through your window, or somebody was to kick your door in and start firing a submachine gun into your living room, your body would quickly go from the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system into the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic division is basically defined as the flight or fight syndrome. It is a carryover from our distant Paleolithic past, when people frequently had to run or fight for their lives. And the parasympathetic, the sympathetic division covers just that. What happens physiologically during the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is that your digestion shuts off. All the blood rushes out of your stomach into your muscles because, you're going to need this oxygenated blood to either fight for your life or run for your life. And there's some peculiar things that happen with your nervous system. There's something attached to the end of every muscle in terms of as it attaches into the tendon and then anchors into the bone, that when that muscle flexes or extends, it's going to move that joint. We're getting now into kind of anatomy and physiology. And basically, there's something called the Golgi tendon organ. The Golgi tendon organ is an apparatus of the nervous system that's designed to shut down 90% of your body's ability to innervate or fire off muscle fibers. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. The Golgi tendon organ is an apparatus of the nervous system that is designed to shut down most of your body's ability to contract its muscle fibers. And the reason for this is this. During a normal muscle contraction arc, meaning you touch something that's heavy that needs to be moved or lifted, the receptors in your muscles at the joint, at the axis of where the joint of the muscle flexes, it sends a signal to the brain. And it says to the brain, there's resistance. There's a weight that needs to be lifted. There's something that needs to be moved, whether it's you got to move a chair or your couch, a barbell that you're trying to pick up, whatever. And this signal, when it hits the brain sends a second signal back to the muscle that says, contract. The muscle fibers, if anybody knows anything about the physiology of muscle fibers, what happens is there's two types of proteins in the muscles, the actin and myosin filaments. And what happens is there's an action potential inside the muscle, which is electrochemical, causes calcium cisterns inside the muscle to break open. And this calcium is released, and it causes a reaction in the proteins inside of the muscle fiber so that the actin and myosin filaments slide across each other. In other words, the muscle shortens. It goes from being elongated to shortened, and as it contracts, the muscle pulls on the tendon pulls on the bone, the joint moves. For instance, if you grab the barbell and you're going to curl this barbell, you're going to do a barbell curl, what would happen is you would get elbow flexation, the bicep muscle would shorten, and it would pull the forearm closer to the humerus. The humerus being the upper arm bone that's attached from the shoulder to the elbow. The forearm, or the radius and the ulna, is, of course, the bones that are attached to your wrist. And so, from your wrist to your elbow. And so, if you got some in your hand, if those two joints come together, you've got something called elbow flexation. Well, that's basically what happens when you get a muscle contraction. It's said that under regular circumstances, if it were not for the Golgi tendon organ, every muscle in your biceps would contract when that signal hit it. You'll get a 100% muscle contraction. And that muscle contraction would be so powerful that it would hurl whatever it is you're trying to pick up through the ceiling and possibly rip your bicep tendon away from the bone because of the explosive contraction would be too powerful for the connective tissue to actually be able to withstand it. So in order to stop you from tearing yourself apart under your own strength, the Golgi tendon organ neutralizes the ability to contract more than a paltry, incredibly small percentage of your total muscle fibers, meaning, less than 10%. So, you grab this barbell or this dumbbell or this heavy package or this box or whatever you're trying to pick up, and the signal from the Golgi tendon organ goes to the brain and tells the brain to shut down 99% of the muscle's ability to generate force. And thus, you only have a small percentage of force that you're capable of using at any one time. Under ordinary circumstances, this is under the parasympathetic division. the sympathetic division, there is a massive amount of epinephrine, or in the normal layman's nomenclature, we're talking about adrenaline. You get this massive adrenaline rush, and what the adrenaline does, it's a chemical that bypasses the Golgi tendon organ and shuts directly across the nerve cell membrane, so that you basically get a massive contraction of muscle fibers because of this chemical called adrenaline. And in fact, for a short period of time, it gives the person that is locked into this syndrome, it gives you superhuman strength. People hear about it all the time. They hear about it in cases where, the classic story of the guy was under the car, fixing the car, the jack broke, and his 120-pound wife looks out of the kitchen window and she sees her husband under the car being crushed, and she runs out without thinking and she lifts the car off of him. She's 120 pounds, but she lifts it back into a car. Well, the adrenaline rush made it possible. This woman temporarily, in order to save her husband's life, she has superhuman strength. Okay? Because of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system and the way that the sympathetic takes over, and it causes this massive adrenaline rush. So this is basically what we're talking about, the fight or flight syndrome. When you get to the Super Soldier program, they were talking about ways of inducing that physiological effect at will through a process of hypnotic induction. But Ziegler was also, not only was he a trained hypnotherapist, he had also created a machine that could send electrical impulses through the muscles and alter the profile of how the nervous system reacts. He was essentially making the nervous system more, shall we say, functional, functional at a higher level. He even had modalities on the machine where, based on the amount of electrical current running through the muscle it took to obtain a contraction, he could even tell the athlete whether the athlete was overtraining or undertraining. So this machine was highly advanced. There was nothing like it on the market, and there was nothing like it on the market today. There are muscle stimulators all over the place. You can go online and order one from various medical companies and what you would call rehabilitation companies and what have you that deal with muscle rehabilitation and things of that nature. Physical therapy, they use them in that. These machines are absolutely nothing compared to what the one Ziegler made. He had the original one. There was nothing like it before he made it, and Ziegler's machine was so effective that they even made a liaison between Ziegler and the White House at the time during the Kennedy administration. They would fly Ziegler in to treat President Kennedy using his machine because President Kennedy had extensive back injuries and back problems from when he was in World War II. And basically, Ziegler's machine basically had a therapeutic, curative effect on Kennedy's back ailments. And so they would actually fly him into the White House to use this on Kennedy. Bruce Lee was, the martial arts icon Bruce Lee was also using this same electrostimulus machine, but he wasn't using it to cure any injuries. He was using it to enhance his speed and power. And that's one of the secrets behind why all these other guys that Bruce Lee trained, Nadia Santos and Richard Bastilio and Larry Hartson, all these guys he trained, none of them are able to do what he did. None of them display the speed or the power that he developed, and I believe his use of the isotron is one of the reasons. He was also using a special weightlifting program that Ziegler also developed. So there's a lot of connections between Bruce Lee and Ziegler, and that'd be another show that we could get into. But basically, this was kind of like the government contracting now part of a super soldier program to a civilian contractor so that he could experiment with it in the public sector. But things got a bit too hot when they started using the machine on Kennedy, and one of the White House liaisons that had brought Ziegler in basically said this machine is so miraculous we should mass produce it. We should make it available to the public. And that man later wound up dead. He was coming back on a hunting trip, and his plane just mysteriously crashed. And after that, there was no mention of the isotron in the public sector ever again by Ziegler or anyone else. So I'm going to end. I'm going to end my my diatribe on it right there. And again, we can take some questions if people have them. If not, maybe we can do a part 2 on this, and I can go into more detail about it and tie it in with the other aspects of MK Ultra in terms of has MK Ultra developed into the 70s and some of the things that were going on with it then and where it may actually be sitting now.
Yes, well, we're down to like 2 minutes. So thank you very much, Rob, for coming in and sharing with us this evening. And we'll definitely have to do a part 2 sometime around, maybe in the next couple of weeks, we'll do a part 2. We've been trying to deal with giving people the background information for what we're ultimately trying to do with this program as far as the Entheogenic Explorer is concerned, dealing with things like the Super Soldier program and entheogens and how these things were working together. We were going to get into this evening dealing with Kennedy's entheogenic use in the White House, being initiated into LSD by his main mistress, Mary Pinchot Meyer, who got a chance to learn from Timothy Leary, and her plan was to turn on and trip with all of the heads of state and things like that in the United States. She had some of her debutante friends, she was a Vassar girl, just like Jackie Kennedy, Vassar girl, to turn on a lot of the people who were in politics at that time so that they would have a better area of being able to look compassionately at the rest of the world. That's really what Kennedy was doing at the last part of his life. He was basically, through utilizing entheogens, he was basically changing his politics and how he dealt with the world about disarmament of nuclear weapons and things like that. So we'll be coming into that in the next couple of weeks. Thank you all for coming out. You can donate to keep the program going at kilindi@hotmail.com, PayPal, KILINDI @hotmail.com, and that's on PayPal. We thank you very much for coming out. We appreciate your coming on with us. So we'll see you next week, and we'll be having a great show next week, and we'll be bringing Rob back in a couple of weeks to continue and finish this whole section of the MK Ultra, super strength, and things like that. Because these are things that we're going to need in the very near future. Thanks. Peace.